Welcome to Free Speech TV. My name is Carl Nagin. I'm here at the 2018 Bioneers Conference, and with me is the manager of Bioneers Indigeneity Program. Alexis Bunten has been at the forefront of helping us to understand problems of cultural appropriation of native tribal wisdom and tribal identity. And she is the author of a book. So how long have you been native? The story of an Alaska tour guide, correct?
Yes.
Good,
Yes.
which she was. She comes from the Aleut tribe, is that correct? Or what is it more?
Aleut is
Aleut, thank you.
the colonizer's name for it. though.
Okay,
so
thank
now
you
we're
for-
taking back our term, Nagin.
Okay, very
Yeah.
good.
And Yupik.
And Yupik. And your tribe was instrumental in stopping the Pebble Mine, as I understand it, one of the largest open pit mining potential disasters in Alaska.
Yeah, that's correct, Carl. However, with Trump's new policies that he immediately implemented upon coming into office to open up federal land for more drilling permits, it's actually back on the table. After that, we thought that battle was won, so it's threatened again.
So that struggle is ongoing.
It's back on, yes.
I want to ask you to help us understand some of the problems of the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. I noticed that Bioneers has signage now about that at the entryway. And Bioneers has been, since its inception, trying to bring tribal wisdom, or the wisdom of tribal peoples, into the discourse of environmental and social justice struggles. So can you help us navigate those waters a bit?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Carl. So, yes, it's true. Bioneers has always honored Indigenous wisdom. The founders of the conference had some really pivotal experiences around raising heirloom seeds, where they learned that Indigenous wisdom was really the key to understanding how to preserve this biodiversity, and that was 30 years ago.
That was Seeds for Change, Nina's.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
And Indigenous voices have always been an integral part of this conference, but sometimes in the environmental NGO space, there has been rampant cultural appropriation. And I think it's because people have, they want to have what Indigenous peoples have. There are dominant narratives in society that Indigenous peoples are at one with nature or close to nature, but it rides it's a slippery slope, because it's also underwritten by underlying cultural ideologies of social Darwinism. These old-fashioned, not true, racialized, fake science ideas from 100 years ago that say that Indigenous peoples are closer to nature and more like animals, and therefore easier to oppress, commoditize, enslave, and so on, with white European people at the pinnacle of this evolution. So we have to be able to unpack some of these underlying ideologies that may be informing, why we think it's okay to put up a teepee out of context or wear a feather headdress out of context. Another level of that is that Indigenous peoples are the most marginalized and erased peoples. Non-native people who aren't in the community, they don't meet Indigenous peoples every day. Or they do, but they don't realize it, right? So like Mexican Americans, they're our biggest minority population in California. Most of them are Indigenous. People don't realize that. So when you don't realize that people exist, it's easy to take on aspects of their culture that seem exotic or sexy or beautiful or close to nature without realizing the true context in which they come from.
It's a romanticized, sentimentalized appropriation then.
Yes, it's romanticized, but romanticized in the lens of the oppressor. So if you ask those people how they saw themselves in their relationship to nature, the answer would be similar, but layered with context of living in place for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. So I just gave you a really
big picture view.
The word I'm looking for is kind of like a highbrow explanation. Well, let me break it down in simple language.
Great. Go
For
for
the
it.
everyday person. So, cultural commodification is the unauthorized taking of another culture's imagery, symbolism, language, arts, dress, clothing, food, outward manifestations of culture from somebody of a dominant social position. There has to be this power element in play for there to be cultural appropriation. There also has to be that unauthorized, not getting permission to do it. Cultural appreciation is when you are, maybe you want to understand or wear something or use a certain symbol from a culture, but instead of just taking it without permission, you take the time to spend time with people in that culture, research that culture, learn about it, learn about the people, the deeper meanings of the symbols. Don't just take the image or the clothing without understanding the broader context. That's cultural appreciation.
So an example of that would be when I go to a museum and I see artifacts that have been taken from Mexico, Peru, countries like that have been illegally excavated, illegally exported, sold on the market for hundreds of thousands of dollars, taken out of context, put in museums. Is that a kind of cultural appropriation, or is that problematic?
That's a great question, because to me your question really brings up the fuzzy lines between cultural appropriation and appreciation. It's really hard to know. There's no hard and fast checklist that
Right.
can tell you now you're appropriating, now you're not appropriating. And you're talking about cultural objects in museums that were often taken during a colonizing period, often taken when there's a power imbalance, taken illegally, or people were coerced into giving them up, and now 100 years later in a museum context. I would say that is at the fuzzy edges of that. A more obvious example of cultural appropriation that we see in the news a lot is people wearing Plains Indian headdresses at music festivals. That's one that's been in the news a lot. You see a lot of privileged young Anglo women in their early 20s, and they wear it and it's a fashion accessory. But these headdresses are really, if you take the time to appreciate the significance of them, they're ceremonial in nature. And even people in the tribes that use them, they can't just wear a feather headdress. You have to be a part of the religion, you have to be a part of the community, and you have to have the right permission and knowledge to use and wear these. So to take it out of context and wear it like that is very disrespectful to the source community. And just to date myself, one maybe analogy to that might be, remember in the 80s when Madonna had like a prayer, and she was wearing a bra and the cross, the Catholic cross, and it pissed off a lot of Catholics because it was very disrespectful to their religion. It was taken out of context and
Eroticized.
And displayed in a way that was very offensive. So it's like one example, an analogy to how it makes people feel in the Native community.
Right, and while it resonates in a white Catholic or ethnic Catholic world, when it happens with Native artifacts, vestments, etc., it doesn't resonate so much with white culture, with those who appropriate.
Well, they don't understand it because they don't
understand
know the context of it. And just to play devil's advocate, when I was a kid and that happened, I was like, who cares? I'm not Catholic, who cares? And that's kind of the same reaction we see among the people who are being defensive of appropriating. They'll say, well, I have a right to wear whatever I want. It's special to me in my context. But here's where the power imbalance comes in. How do you have the right to say, that you can wear whatever you want? without respecting people who have a set of beliefs. And if you go in the deeper context of it, you know, America is founded on genocide and white supremacy. And for Native people, you know, you get your land taken away, you're killed by smallpox, you're killed by militias. We're talking genocide. Children were taken away, sent to boarding schools for generations. People have been discriminated against. There's ongoing policies that are discriminatory, and people are holding on to their culture, their beliefs. So if you're taking like the last thing people have been holding on to and that keep you going and solid in your identity, it's pretty disrespectful.
It's a cultural genocide that
Yes.
continues, an evolution of the actual material personhood
Yes.
genocide. And we can move this to another level if we talk about the environment. So in part of what natives have known for centuries is the sacredness of the earth. The environmental movement that's now entering the discourse here at Bioneers and elsewhere of how we think about climate change, how we think about ourselves and our relationship to nature. Can you talk about that? In particular with respect to rights of Mother Earth and rights of nature as a legal issue. That's a big one.
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part.
Sorry.
Kind of a two-part. No. Well, indigenous peoples are associated with understanding the rights of Mother Earth and having a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness between all beings and the elements on the planet. And one statistic that is used a lot is that the remaining indigenous lands in the world hold up to 80% of the world's biodiversity, and they're holding and stewarding that. So what about the other part of the earth that's not in indigenous hands? What have people done to it, you know, for it to lose all the biodiversity? And a lot of it has to do with capitalism, thinking of nature as and the advent of legal systems as capitalism entered into the world order after the Middle Ages, after the Enlightenment.
Earth as property rather than the
Yes.
commons.
Yes, thinking of the earth as property. And so all law is built around the earth being property. And that turns it into a commodity that can be bought or sold with resources that can be had. And you're actually taking when you think of things as resources, you are separating them from the interconnectedness to ecosystems and the elements that it's a part of. And if your brain is automatically not thinking of the connectedness, then it's easy to take a piece out or to do a monocrop for years that destroys the underlying system. It's actually embedded and rooted in the way we think. So in a lot of indigenous worldviews, we automatically think in terms of relatedness. The relatedness of plants to water, to birds, to four-legged creatures, to rocks, that they're all a part of it. And so if you disrupt one part of it, it disrupts the rest of it. And when you think of the earth in that way, it's easy to think about it. Now, the earth being rights-bearing, that's a legal mechanism to protect it. But rights of nature law intrinsically understands and upholds the rights of the planet, of Mother Earth, of ecosystems to exist as it is. So unlike current environmental law, which provides reparations after the damage has been done, rights of nature law actually is proactive, and and if damages are done to a certain protected ecosystem that's seen to have rights, then you're not just paying out a person whose land has been depleted or resources depleted. You actually have to pay for the restitution of the land back to the ecosystem that it should be.
You have to restore it.
You have to restore it. So
Is this...
I know I answered the second part of your question just now.
Well, let's stay with it because
Yeah.
this is interesting to me. There are places in the world that do this, that have created institutional and legal frameworks for this. I believe in India, the Ganges is designated as a
Yeah. I'm not sure about this, but I think I heard that ruling was overturned.
Ah, interesting.
So,
Okay. No, thanks for correcting me. I
so
didn't
we
know that.
may.
We may not have that yet.
I'm not really. I'm not up to speed on that. However, the landmark ruling of the Wanganui River and Te Urawewa Park in New Zealand, those were in partnership with Maori tribes. So the Whanganui River has been granted rights. The river has been granted rights. And it's actually that happened as part and parcel of a 150-year-long battle among the Maori who lived along the river to gain recognition for their original claims to those lands. And they had to prove that they were there first, and they went through, like I said, the case was filed 150 years ago. And a lot of evidence had to be brought to bear, and as part of settling that land claims to return it back to its rightful owners from the British Crown and now the New Zealand government, part of that settlement was to grant personhood to that river, because that was brought forth by the Maori claimants that this is their worldview. So they were able to codify that into their land claims law. And a lot of the rights of nature law that has been granted has happened in countries that have a great indigenous presence, bigger in numbers, possibly in voices, possibly in representation, that where that worldview can be brought to bear on legal mechanisms.
Is Bioneers involved in advancing that or in advocating for that? And how are you doing that, if so?
Yeah. Great. Glad you asked that. Yeah. The Indigeneity program, we have been embarking on a Rights of Nature initiative over the past almost 2 years now, I would like to say. And it's been a bit under the radar because we've been piloting some grassroots organizing in Indian country in the U.S. around the rights of nature, learning about, what kind of capacity building would need to happen in Indian country. And by that, because we're the Indigeneity program, we don't go in and say, here's what we think you should do. We just say, there's people talking about the rights of nature. This tribe is interested in that. That tribe is interested in it. This indigenous organization is interested in it. Well, we can provide you with some of the legal resources and some of the capacity building so that you can self-determine for yourself whether this type of thing that the Maori have done is interesting for you on your reservations. And what's really exciting about the rights of nature, specifically in Indian country, is that U.S. federally recognized tribes have a nation-to-nation relationship with the U.S. federal government through treaties. That means they have certain types of legal sovereign immunity. So if a city, a municipality, or a state adopts rights of nature in the U.S., federal law will override that. If some corporation lobbies the federal government and puts pressure on the policymakers to put down a rights of nature initiative, it'll happen. Or a corporation backed by federal law may be able to sue a city. With tribal nations on reservation lands, that's not the case because of this sovereign to sovereign relationship between nations. So it's nation to nation. The federal government's laws can't, theoretically, it hasn't been tried yet, they can't trump, not to make a bad pun.
Terrific pun.
It can't trump law on tribal law on those reservations.
So one place where this was playing out, it seemed to me, was in Tonto National Forest, Nyland Pike's efforts there. But the problem there is that was a state national forest. Is that correct? It was not designated as tribal land.
I believe it's a state national forest, but I don't think it's a part of the San Carlos Reservation. And in order for rights of nature to work on a tribal level, it has to be adopted within the tribe's constitution. It can't be customary law. So customary law is like traditional law, a law that you live in your culture. It actually has to be codified into your tribal constitution. It can't just be symbolic.
It's a structural piece.
Yes, it has to be enforceable.
Right. Okay. I want to switch topics a little bit and return to the question of cultural identity appropriation. We've had a very recent and public example of this with Elizabeth Warren. And I wonder how you view that in the discourse that's arisen around that controversy.
Well, when Elizabeth Warren's alleged self-claimed Cherokee identity was in the news a couple of years ago during the last election, I was really angry because I saw her on the public stage talking about this Cherokee identity, and quite frankly, there are estimates that upwards of 50% of American Southerners claim Cherokee identity, to the point where it's a joke among Native people. When someone comes up to them and says, "Oh, my grandmother was Cherokee," you're like, "Yeah, family myth, heard that a million times." And it's really offensive because it undermines tribal sovereignty, which means that tribes, as tribal nations, have a right to determine their own membership. So tribes in America determine membership in many different ways. The Cherokees go by lineal descendancy. Some tribes go by what we call blood quantum, how much blood percentage you have. It's actually an adopted colonial concept. And other tribes determine descendancy in different ways. So for her to claim that identity what's offending a lot of Native people is that she's claiming it based on a Eurocentric notion of blood quantum, and she's also claiming her Native identity based on a DNA test, which is Western technoscience, which is upholding racialized notions of identity. And in fact, as an anthropologist, these ethnicities and populations that the companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com pick, those are arbitrary terms that are based on contemporary ethnicities, based on people's self-purported identities within sample populations, and names and identities change over time. So it's making a lot of Native people angry that by saying that she's Native based on a DNA test, that is saying that Western DNA science
Is the arbiter,
the arbiter of identity.
Right.
Exactly. And it is just another way to say, no, your opinion doesn't count. You don't have a right to say who your members are. You don't have a right to say that. So while some people in the Native community are okay with Elizabeth Warren's outing of her DNA test, because she does make it clear that she's not a member of any tribe, and that she just has this lineal descendancy based on these DNA markers, other people are very, very angry because it's just another white woman or white person in power again, reifying that it's those in power, the dominant society, that gets to decide who's Indian, who's Native, who's not Native, when really tribes have their own power to determine their own membership. It's your community tells you who you are. If you've never been there and you don't know them and they don't know you and they're not accepting you, then you're not a member of the tribe.
That's not your identity card.
Yeah, at the end of the day. Yeah. That's not to say DNA tests aren't awesome. I interpret them all the time. I think they're really fun. But you have to know how to interpret them and understand them, and then how to, bring that out into the world. And one last thing, I have not yet heard her, even before this came out, I was discussing this with my friends, I haven't yet heard her apologize to the Cherokee Nation for her claims that she's been making all along.
Alexis Bunten, thank you very much for helping us to understand all this. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And you're a wonderful spokesperson
thank
for Bioneers
you.
and for indigeneity. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. This is great.